In the last video, we set up our Experience site and got everything pushed up on GitHub. We now have the ability to deploy our site to any fresh Scratch org. In this video, we will start building our first Lightning Web component, which is this responsive hero section. During that process, we will learn how to use static resources to store and reference images in Salesforce. We will also explore using the local Lightning development server to do some of our styling and general development. Here we are in Visual Studio Code with our SFDX project that we created last time. So since it's been a little while since the last video, we don't actually have an org running. So the first thing we'll do is create a default Scratch org. And remember that we modified the project Scratch def JSON file last time to include the Experience Builder and site, or the communities and site features. So we're going to create a Scratch org and just name it the same thing as the project for organizational purposes. All right, we have the new Scratch org created called Portfolio Site, so we can now deploy our project to it. Set project, deploy, start. You can also run this command by right-clicking on, I think you have to right-click here and say deploy source to org. That would effectively do the same thing. I just prefer the short command line command. Okay, we now have a fresh Scratch org with our project deployed, so let's open that up. Org open, just to verify that we can access our Experience Builder. Sometimes you'll deploy a new Scratch org and you won't have access to Experience Builder. So here we are in a Scratch org. We'll go to all sites. And good, we have access to Builder. Let's click on that. Okay, and there's our text from last time. So everything's set up for us to start working. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to do a hero section for our portfolio site. So I have a couple of images that I generated from Midjourney, just so I don't have any issues with using an actual person's face. So in this folder, I have two photos. One I'm going to use for the hero image, and then one I'll use for the About Me section in a later video. So one thing that we can do, just a simple thing we can do, these images are actually quite large. So if I open this up and go to properties, this image is 800 kilobytes, which is kind of a large image for a web image. So one easy thing you can do is go to a website and minimize that image file. So what we're going to do is go to tinypng.com. And we're going to drag our images in there. And now we can download the compressed versions. And let's extract those. And now you can see that Hero PNG is only 222 kilobytes. So we reduced the size by quite a bit. So that'll help for the page loads a little bit. So let's grab both of these. We'll save these images for later. We'll just leave them right here. The next thing we're going to do is take those images and upload them to our Salesforce org using a static resource. So you can do this through the UI, but I find the easiest way to manage your static resource folder is through Visual Studio Code. So let's copy these files. Actually, let's make the folder first. So if we scroll down here and open up the, let's see, I'll show you some context. We're in the Force app main default folder. If you scroll down a little bit, you can see that there is a static resources folder. And within that, because we made a digital experience site, we have an example site samples folder and the metadata file that represents a static resource. So what we can do is just replicate this. So within site samples are the actual resources. So within that folder, it's like what's inside the zip file. And out here, this metadata file tells Salesforce that it is a static resource. So what we're going to do is replicate that. So we're going to create a new folder under static resources, and we're going to call it portfolio. Oh, we'll just call it images. That's simpler. And then we will also create a metadata file in the static resources folder. So I'll create a new file, and we'll call this one, you have to name it the same name as the folder. So we'll call this images.resource meta XML. And then we'll go, let's get rid of that. Then we'll go to our example meta file. And you can see in this metadata file that there's really not much that differentiates it. The only thing we really need to change here is the description. So I'm just going to copy the entire contents of this metadata file and paste them into this new metadata file. And I'll say, these are the images for our portfolio site. Great. So if I save that, I have everything set up, but we still need to take those minified PNGs and copy them into the folder in our SFDX project. So if I go back to the unzipped folder here, I can copy these guys. And then I can open this folder by right-clicking on, let me scroll up, right-click on that and say Reveal in File Explorer. And here's the images folder. So if I go in there and paste the two images, they'll now show up in Visual Studio Code. There they are. Now, if I go deploy our code via the terminal window, and I say SF project deploy, start, that will deploy our images in a zip file as a static resource in our Salesforce org. Okay, there we go. So you can see it said type static resource, name images. So then if we go open up our, we don't need that anymore. We can open up our org, and I can go to static resources. You can see now we have an images static resource. If I click on that and view file, which will just download it, we now have an images.zip, and it has the two images that we're going to use for our site in there. So now we know Salesforce has our images. The next step is to create our first Lightning Web Component. And we'll just create a Lightning Web Component. I'll show you how that works and how that shows up in Experience Builder. And then we'll add the images to it, or add the image, only one image to the hero. So let's go up to the LWC folder, right click on that and say create Lightning Web Component. And we'll just call this hero, accept the default folder. Okay, so now we have a hero HTML.js inside a hero folder. So from here, we need to modify the metadata file for our Lightning Web Component such that the Experience Builder can use it. So we need to change is exposed to true, and then we need to add a couple of targets. So we're saying this is what we're targeting for this Lightning Web Component. And the two targets we need to add are, oops, that's, okay. Two targets we need to add are the Lightning community page, and then we need the Lightning community default. Okay, so now let's just add something to our hero to let us know that when we put it into Experience Builder, this is the component that we created. So let's just put an H1 in there. and say, hey, this is our hero LWC. Okay, so now if we deploy, we should be able to go into Experience Builder and add our new LWC to the page. Okay, so let's open up Experience Builder, refresh. And I'll delete the previous text block. And in components, we should be able to scroll to the bottom to the custom components, and we now have a hero custom component. So I'll put that out here. And sure enough, well, can't see it too well. This is our hero LWC. Okay, so now we know how to create and deploy a Lightning Web component. But we need to make our hero out of it. So the first thing we need to do is start displaying our image. So in the HTML, instead of this h1 tag, we're going to put in an image tag. And the source of our image is usually URL, but in this case, we're going to reference a variable in our JavaScript that we put the URL in Salesforce to the image. It'll make sense in a second. So if I go into the JavaScript and create a variable, we'll just call it image URL. We're going to need to assign that to the URL that Salesforce uses to store our image. So let's see, we need to import the static resource. So up here, we're going to go import images from Salesforce. Oops. Salesforce, and then it's always Salesforce / resource URL, and then a / and the name of your static resource. So in our case, we call ours images, right? Images, correct. So images. Now, this will be most of the URL we need. We just need to concatenate or add the file name to the end of this, this path. So images URL equals images, and this is just a string. So we're going to add images plus / the name of our image, I believe, is this hero PNG, hero.png. Okay, so now we have this JavaScript variable images URL. We just need to assign the image HTML tag, the source attribute of the image HTML tag, to this variable. So if we go back to our hero HTML, we can modify the source to just point to the image URL variable. Okay, so that should all be hooked up. Now I could deploy this to Salesforce, the Salesforce org, to show it in Experience Builder. What I'm going to do instead is I'm going to open it up in the LWC local development environment. So there will be a link to how to set this up in the video description. But once you get this set up, you can go to hero.html and you can scroll down and say preview component locally. And we'll use the desktop browser. So what this will do is use our attached Scratch org and our local environment to display components without actually having to deploy the LWC all the way to our Salesforce org. And you'll see how much quicker it is to make changes. Okay, and there's our image. It's quite large, but we have now successfully displayed our image from the static resource onto an LWC component. So if I wanted to make this smaller, I could I could add a CSS file here. So I could say new file, hero.css, and I could do an image tag selector. I could say image, and we'll just say width, just for demonstration, 50%. And you can see the changes happen not instantly, but pretty fast. Now, if I were to do a deployment from Visual Studio to our Scratch org instead, so if I say Salesforce, or I'll just do the up arrow. If I deploy it, you can see how much longer deployment takes. Well, I wish it was pretty fast, but sometimes it takes longer. Let's go open our Experience Builder. And if we refresh, we'll go back to Builder and refresh. We should see the text is replaced with our image. And there it is. So we went through a lot just there. We connected a static resource image. We modified the HTML, we modified the JavaScript, and we added a CSS file. So I kind of glossed over that. In order to add CSS to your bundle, all you have to do is add a CSS file that matches the name of your bundle, which is the folder, and you see all the file names have the same name. You just have to add that CSS, and it's automatically included in your HTML. And you can just start selecting things like you usually would in CSS. Okay. So now that we have all of that set up, the next step is to add some other HTML components, and most notably what we need for the call to action. So the call to action will have probably headline text and then some smaller supporting text and potentially a button for the action at the bottom. So if we go into here, we have the image. Let's add the headline text. Just make it an H1 and say, my name is Jane Doe. And then the supporting text, we'll just make it a paragraph. And we'll say, let's do business together. And let's add a button at the bottom that says contact me. Okay, so if we look at this in the preview, we can see that we now have that text in our Lightning component. So the first thing you want to do at this point, because it doesn't look very good, right? Let's just do some simple styling, and let's style it first for mobile. So we want a single column with the image and the text and the button looking nice, all in one straight line, which is good because right now this is the size that we have. It looks about right. So let me give us a little bit more space here. And let's see. Let's start by making our H1 text a little bit bigger. So I think we already have, let me close this. We already have, well, let's get rid of our, we don't actually want width of 50 on our image. So let's just save that. So it takes up the whole space. 100% will just take up the width of the container, which is kind of what we want on a response or the mobile design. And for the H1, let's make the text, let's say 36 pixels. So we'll say font size, 36 pixels. See what that looks like. Yeah, that's reasonable. And let's do for the paragraph, let's call that, let's try 24. I think by default it's a 16 pixels. So we'll say font size 24 pixels. Okay, great. Next thing, probably for the single column layout, we're going to want things centered. So let's put a container around our call to action items here. So if we go back into our HTML, let's separate these two. We'll just call this call to action. So we got a div with the class name call to action. And put our items in there. So now if we select that class, we should be able to, I think I can just do a text align center here. Probably the simplest way to do this. There we go. That's one way to get the items all in the middle there. So the next thing I would say is probably to put some margins and padding in here. So I would say the headline is probably a little too close to everything else. So we got the headline. We could just give the headline and paragraph both top margins. Say margin top. Oh, not like that. That's not how you do margin top. And let's give it 15 pixels. Okay, looks a little better. Let's do for the paragraph, we'll give them a margin top of a little bit less. Maybe go. Actually, I think it looks fine the way it is. Maybe we'll just add some margin to the button. We'll do 10 pixels on that guy. Okay, so that's starting to look pretty okay. We don't need to completely style it right now. Next thing I'd like to do is maybe, let's put a little border on the image just to make it look a little nicer. So let's say border, maybe give it 2 pixels, solid border, and we'll just make it black. That looks a little better. And let's do a border radius, so around the corners of it a little bit. And I don't know, maybe a 7 pixel. That might look okay. Yeah, that looks pretty nice. I like to do the same thing to the button, so let's do a little, let's give the button a little border radius. Not spell the word radius. 7 pixels. Round the corners off just a touch. And give it a little border. So that's a nice look. I like that. And I would say, I think I'd like some more padding on that button. So maybe give the button a couple pixels of padding. Ooh, that doesn't actually look very good. There, that looks a little nicer. Okay, so don't need to tweak that too much more for now, but that's starting to look okay. So let's deploy that to our Scratch org. So if I go back and open up my terminal window, it's looking a little funky. And we'll deploy the project and have a look in Experience Builder and see how it looks. Let's refresh that. And it is gigantic. So obviously at these big screen sizes, it doesn't look very good. But if we shrink it down, or if we go into our dev tools here hit F12, and look at a smaller version of it, looks much nicer. So we kind of have an okay starting point for our mobile version of the site, or our mobile size. So what we need to do next is talk about how do we change it for larger screen sizes. So if I go back out of the dev tools, hit F12 again, we probably, for one, want the image size to be much smaller. And another common thing to do is to make multiple columns. So we're probably going to want the image on one side and the call to action, the text, on the other side. So let's go find an example of some CSS that will allow us to have two equally spaced and sized columns. And what I like to do is go to W3 Schools and the how-to section. This how-to section has a bunch of really nice examples of common patterns of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript that you can basically just copy and at least get an idea of how things are supposed to work. So if we scroll down on the sidebar, I'm going to use an example called images side by side, or side by side images. So let's click on that. And here it says, learn how to align images side by side with CSS. Now we have one image and one text, but effectively they're both just containers. So this should work for our purposes. So if we click on try it for yourself, we can look at the CSS here. Let's look at the HTML first, actually. So scroll down. You can see that there are 3 images, and they're each in a div with the class column. Okay, so what do we do with the column? Up here, it looks like every column gets a width of 33%, so they divide it equally. And we use float left, which just means they'll show up in a line if they fit. So we're going to take the example CSS from the W3 Schools exercise or how-to and put that into our LWC component CSS. So here we have our hero CSS. We will add an entry for the column class. And I'm going to take this padding out. And I'm going to also rename column. I kind of like container better. So we have a container class that will move the things in a row with the float left. And we want the width to only be 50% because we only have 2 items. So we'll say 50%. Now if I go into the HTML, we already have kind of a container class for the call to action. So I'm just going to add the container class to that. And then we will create a new div around our image. So if I say container, let's stick our image inside that div. Okay. So now, if we go and look at our live server here, our local server, you can see both of our components are equal size. They're both taking up 50% of the container width, of the outside container width. In this case, the outside container is just the template. And they're next to each other. Now at this point, they don't really scale. We kind of want our mobile view of our small devices to look more like a single column with the image on top and the text on the bottom. So in order to do that, we need to pick a point at which we don't use 2 columns, we use 1 column. So what we're going to do is use what's called a media query. So a media query, let's go open up our browser window here. If we say search for media query breakpoints, once again, W3 Schools has a nice page for this. So let's go to the W3 Schools again. And we can create conditional CSS depending on the screen size. So in this case, medium devices, anything smaller than 768 pixels, we want to show up as 1 column. So we can just copy this example media query from W3 Schools and put it into our CSS. Then within these brackets, we will just put all the CSS we want to apply for smaller screen sizes. In this case, it's basically just this. This is the only thing, only piece of CSS we used to make 2 columns instead of 1. So let's just remove that from the main CSS and put it inside this media query. So if I save that, and we go back to our live update, you can see that it's now 1 column. And if I expand this window, it flips up to 2 columns. So now our design is a little bit more responsive. So for bigger screens, we'll have 2 columns, and for smaller screens, we'll have 1 column. So that's fantastic. Let's deploy that change to our Scratch org and see what it looks like in Experience Builder. So if I open up the terminal window once again, let's deploy that project. Oh, I was spacing out there. We're all good to go. Let's open up Experience Builder one more time. And you can see that in Experience Builder, we now have columns side by side. And if we reduce the screen size, we get a single column. Now my resolution is turned way up so that you guys can see everything, but 1 column, 2 columns. So that's how you write a responsive media query, or that's how you use media queries to make a responsive layout. Okay, one other small thing I'd like to change before we wrap up here is this call to action is far too high on the page. So one thing we can do is go ahead and give it a margin. Let's close this container. So we don't want to have the margin applied to both container types, both the call to action. I guess I'll point at the HTML while I talk. Both this container and this container. So we're going to use the call to action class to give that whole set of items more space from the top. So here I will do the call to action selector, and I will say margin. Let's just do the margin top for right now. Margin top, and we'll say 10% of the component size. Now let's see what that looks like in our local server. So it looks a little bit better. Okay, so now that we have our hero, it's plain, but it's kind of coming together. Let's push that up to Git. So let's go to the source control icon and write a commit message. And we'll say added hero section LWC to our portfolio site. And we'll click this drop-down arrow to say commit and push. This will commit it locally to the local Git repository, and it will also push it up to our GitHub repository that we created in the last video. Yes, we would like to stage and commit all of our changes. In the next video, I will show you how to launch a contact dialog from the Contact Me button in our call to action. We will be using an HTML form to accomplish this task.